He fled with his wife to an abandoned ranch, hoping to start over. But the well on their land held a secret that no one was supposed to find. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The sun was barely rising over the vast sweep of the plains when James Harper pulled his worn hat lower over his brow and looked back over the trail behind him. The horizon was little more than a dull line of gray against the sky, broken by the occasional shadow of a mesquite tree or a distant bluff. And somewhere beyond that line was the town he would never return to. The ruts his wagon wheels left in the dry earth stretched back into the distance, like a reminder of all he had abandoned. The small bunkhouse where he once played cards with the other hands. The corral where he had broken his first wild Mustang. The dusty street where his own brother now wore the star of sheriff. James knew that by noon the heat would erase those tracks entirely, just as he hoped time would erase the memory of who he had been before this journey began. He turned back to the trail ahead, where Ayanna walked a few steps behind the wagon, her shawl wrapped around her head to keep out the dawn chill, their son cradled against her back. Life had never been simple for James, but it had been clear once. The cattle drives, the endless skies, the sound of hooves drumming the earth. These had been his world. He had grown up under the wide Texas sky, a boy who could rope a steer before he could read, who learned early that a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the quiet way he bore his troubles. He had been a good cowboy, maybe even one of the best in the county, though he never bragged. The work was hard but honest, and at the end of the day there was always the bunkhouse fire, the low voices of the men telling stories, the comfort of routine. Everything had changed the day he met Ayanna. She was from a nearby tribe, a people the settlers spoke of in whispers, as if they were a shadow that refused to be pushed aside. She was not a shadow. She was alive with a quiet strength, her dark eyes steady, her laughter like water running over stone. At first they met by accident near the river, when he was watering his horse and she was gathering herbs. Then by choice. It had started as stolen moments, glances that lingered too long, short exchanges of words that did not matter as much as the silences between them. It became something he could no longer deny. When he married her by the fire one night under the witness of her people, he felt more himself than he ever had before. The town did not forgive him. Men who had once shared whiskey with him turned their faces away. His own brother came to him, badge glinting in the sun, telling him he had shamed the family name. Threats followed, muttered warnings at the saloon, stones thrown near the cabin where he and Ayanna tried to live quietly. When the first shots rang out one night and splintered their doorframe, James knew there would be no peace as long as they stayed. So they left. In the dead of night, he sold the last of his herd for half its worth, loaded their meager belongings into a battered wagon, and led his wife and son out across the plains. The first days were grueling. They crossed country so dry and open it seemed to swallow sound. Dust clung to their clothes and hair, and the baby cried from the heat until Ayanna could find enough shade to soothe him. James rode with his rifle across his lap, half expecting riders to appear behind them. At night they camped under the stars, cooking beans over a small fire, the crackle of flames the only sound. Sometimes James lay awake long after Ayanna slept, staring at the endless sweep of stars, and wondering if he had done the right thing or doomed them all to die on the trail. But slowly the land began to change. The wide grasslands gave way to rolling hills, then to scattered stands of cottonwood. They passed through towns where no one knew them, where James could buy supplies without feeling the weight of accusing stares. He began to dream of a place where no one would find them, a place where Ayanna could sing to their son without fear of who might hear. When he found the notice tacked to the post of a small-town store, land for sale cheap, abandoned but still fertile, he felt something tighten and then release in his chest. It was as though the land itself had been waiting for him. They traveled for another week before they reached it. 100 acres of near-forgotten earth, an old ranch house with a roof sagging like an old man's back. Fences leaning or broken, pastures overrun with weeds. But to James it was beautiful. The horizon stretched unbroken in all directions, the nearest neighbor miles away. There was a barn that might still hold up after a few repairs, a well near the porch, a grove of twisted trees to break the wind. He walked the property line as the sun set that first night, the sky blazing orange and purple, and felt a strange calm settle over him. This was theirs. No man could tell them to leave. No posse would ride out here to take them away. The first weeks were hard. The house smelled of rot and dust, and the first rainstorm sent water pouring through gaps in the roof. James worked from dawn to dark patching shingles, clearing brush, mending what he could. His hands blistered and bled, but he kept going. Ayanna planted herbs and beans in a patch of cleared soil and taught their son to crawl on the packed earth of the yard. There were nights when the coyotes howled close enough to make the horses restless, mornings when the wind blew so cold it cut through every seam of the house, but James felt alive in a way he had not in years. The days settled into rhythm. Mornings began with the soft light spilling through the broken shutters, the smell of smoke from the fire where Ayanna cooked cornmeal. James fed the animals, repaired fences, and began to dream of building something more permanent. He imagined corrals full of cattle again, imagined teaching his son to ride, imagined a life where the boy would not have to run from anything. Still, there were moments when the past rose up like a ghost. Sometimes when he looked at the horizon, he thought he saw riders far off, only for them to vanish in the shimmer of heat. Sometimes he heard the echo of his brother's voice telling him he had betrayed his own blood. But each time he looked at the land, the barn standing like a stubborn sentinel, the windmill creaking in the breeze, he reminded himself that this was a new beginning. By the end of the first season, James had fixed the worst of the roof, repaired half the fence line, and coaxed water from the old well with a rope and bucket. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them alive. On the evening when he hauled up a full bucket clear of mud for the first time, Ayanna smiled at him with quiet pride, and James felt something shift in his chest. The burden he had carried since the night they fled seemed a little lighter. He stood on the porch that night long after the others had gone inside, the prairie stretching out before him under a sky thick with stars. The wind moved through the grass like a tide, whispering through the darkness. For the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to believe they had a future here. The house might be broken, the land might be wild, but it was theirs, and as long as he had strength in his arms, he would fight to keep it standing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, lonely and sharp, but James did not flinch. He tipped his hat back, breathed the cool night air, and went inside, ready for whatever the next day would bring. The months passed in a slow rhythm that gave James the illusion of stability, but the prairie has a way of reminding a man how small his plans are compared to the forces that shape the land. The summer came hotter than he expected, the sky a hard, relentless blue by day, and the earth cracking under the weight of so many cloudless weeks. The grass in the pastures turned brittle, crumbling under his boots when he walked the fence line. Even the windmill, which had groaned faithfully through the spring, seemed to spin with a tired sound, its blades squealing against the dry gusts that rolled down from the hills. James had known hard weather before, had ridden through dust storms and slept through nights when the temperature dropped low enough to frost his beard. But this heat felt different. It was not simply weather, it was a test. Each morning he rose earlier, hoping to draw water before the sun baked the ground too fiercely. At first the bucket came up as usual, cool and wet, the sound of it sloshing against the sides of the well almost comforting. But as the weeks dragged on, the rope grew lighter in his hands. The waterline was dropping. He watched it carefully, measuring it against a notch he had carved into the stone lip of the well, and every few days he saw it sink lower. Ayanna tried to hide her worry, carrying water carefully and rationing it so that their son had enough to drink. But James could see the fear in her eyes when she glanced toward the well. Then came the morning when the bucket came up empty. He lowered it again, listening for the familiar splash at the bottom, but only the hollow thud of the bucket hitting dry earth came back to him. The sound made his stomach twist. He hauled the bucket back up, stared into its emptiness, and felt a chill run through him, despite the heat rising from the ground. For a moment he considered waiting, hoping for a storm to sweep across the plains and fill the well again. But the sky remained a blazing dome with no promise of rain. Without water, the animals would not last a week, and neither would they. That night, James sat long after Ayanna had gone to bed, sharpening his shovel and staring out at the land that had seemed such a refuge. It had given him hope, and now it was daring him to prove he deserved to stay. At first light, he tied a rope around a post near the porch, slung the shovel across his back, and lowered himself into the well. The stones were rough and scraped against his palms, but he descended slowly, boots finding purchase in the cracks. When he reached the bottom, he crouched in the gloom, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering down from the circle of sky above. The earth was dry and packed, but as he ran his hands over the walls of the well, he felt something that made him pause. A section of stone that did not sit flush with the others. James pressed against it, first with his fingers, then with the flat of his hand. The stone shifted slightly, sending a trickle of dirt falling at his feet. He worked at it patiently, pulling away loose earth, and as he did, he uncovered the edge of what looked like a flat slab, sealing an opening behind it. The sight of it sent a prickle down his spine. Wells sometimes had side chambers, old cisterns or runoff channels, but this looked deliberate, like a doorway that had been hidden long ago. He hesitated, his breath coming hard in the still air. Part of him wanted to climb back up, fill the well again with stones, and forget he had ever seen it. But another part, the same part of him that had kept him alive on the trail, that had pushed him to leave the town where he was no longer welcome, would not allow him to turn away. He wedged the edge of the shovel against the slab and pried until it gave way with a low groan, revealing a dark opening beyond. The air that rushed out was cooler than the stifling heat of the well, damp and heavy with the smell of earth that had been undisturbed for decades. James pulled a small lantern from his belt, lit it with shaking hands, and ducked into the opening. The passage was narrow, forcing him to hunch as he moved forward, the lantern casting long, quivering shadows on the rough walls. The silence was so complete he could hear the thud of his own heartbeat. The tunnel led downward at a gentle slope, the earth beneath his boots turning from dry dust to damp clay. He passed old timbers bracing the ceiling, their wood blackened with age, some splintered and rotting. Once or twice he stopped, thinking he heard the faint sound of water dripping in the distance, but when he held his breath, the noise faded, leaving only the stillness. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small chamber. The ceiling rose just high enough for him to stand fully upright. In the lantern light, he saw a few rusted tools scattered on the ground. A pickaxe head, the handle long since turned to dust, a dented bucket. Against one wall lay what he first thought were stones, but when he crouched closer, he realized with a jolt that they were bones, pale and dry, half buried in the dirt. A chill passed over him that had nothing to do with the coolness of the air. He stared at the bones for a long moment, then forced himself to look away. On the opposite wall, barely visible through the grime, were scratches in the earth. He brushed them with his gloved hand and saw faint letters, carved clumsily but deep. Some were in English, others in a language he did not recognize, and near the bottom a few words in Spanish. Cerrado para siempre, closed forever. The message made his skin crawl. He backed away, nearly stumbling over the pickaxe head, and turned toward the tunnel. His lantern flickered as though it too wished to leave. James retraced his steps quickly, his boots sending small avalanches of dirt down the passage, until the circle of daylight from the well appeared ahead of him. He climbed the rope hand over hand, muscles straining, and pulled himself over the lip of the well, breathing hard. For a long time he sat there on the ground, the sun beating down on his shoulders, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the distant cry of a hawk overhead. He wanted to tell Ayana what he had found, to warn her that the land they had chosen as their refuge might be hiding something far darker than a dry well. But when he saw her standing near the porch with their son in her arms, her face lit with a smile of hope, as if expecting good news, the words caught in his throat. Instead, he brushed the dust from his clothes, coiled the rope neatly, and said only that the well needed more work. That night, as the sky turned to velvet and the first stars appeared, he lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the stillness of the prairie. It was a silence so deep it seemed to press against the walls of the house. Somewhere out there a coyote cried, but it sounded distant and lonely, not threatening. What unnerved him was not the sound of the night, but the memory of what lay beneath their feet, hidden in the dark, waiting. Sleep came in short, restless stretches, filled with dreams of tunnels that twisted endlessly downward, and voices whispering in languages he could not understand. Each time he woke, his heart was racing, his mouth dry as if he had been breathing dust. By dawn, he was sitting at the table, staring at the rope and the shovel as though they held an answer. He could not leave the opening as it was. Whatever lay down there had been buried for a reason, and the thought of leaving it half uncovered felt like inviting trouble. When the sun rose high enough to warm the yard, James walked to the well again. He stood with his hands braced on the stone rim, looking down into the shadowed depths. He knew he would go back. He did not know when, but he could feel it pressing against him as surely as the heat pressed against his skin. The land had given him a riddle, and until he solved it, there would be no peace. That day he worked harder than he had in weeks, repairing a section of fence that had sagged, clearing brush near the barn, anything to keep his hands busy. But every time he straightened his back and looked toward the house, he saw the well standing silent and still, as though it were watching him. The sun dipped low, turning the sky to fire, and still he found excuses not to go inside. Only when darkness swallowed the prairie did he finally step onto the porch, his body aching, his throat dry. Inside, Ayanna had lit a small lamp, its glow soft and golden. She smiled at him, handed him a cup of water she had saved from the last bucket they had drawn, and for a moment James almost allowed himself to believe that everything was ordinary. But when he lay down that night, staring up at the beams of the ceiling, the silence of the well returned to him, deep and hollow. He could almost feel the cool air rising from it, carrying with it the smell of earth and rust. He closed his eyes, but the image of the words carved into the wall would not leave him. Closed forever. He wondered what it meant, and why someone had felt the need to write it. By the time the first light crept over the horizon, he knew that ignoring it was no longer possible. Something waited down there, something that had been left behind by men long dead, and the land had chosen him to uncover it. He rose, tightened his belt, and stepped out into the morning air, ready to face what lay hidden beneath the earth. The morning sun rose pale over the prairie, casting long shadows across the yard, and James felt the weight of its light like a summons. He had tried to distract himself the day before, working until his hands ached and his back burned, but the unease had not loosened its grip. Even in sleep he had not been free of it. His dreams had been filled with narrow walls and muffled cries that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dreams so vivid he woke drenched in sweat and listening for sounds that were not there. By dawn he had made his decision. Whatever waited in the darkness beneath the well would not leave him alone until he faced it. He gathered what he could find to prepare himself, taking his time as if each act could steady his racing thoughts. The lantern was cleaned and filled with fresh oil. He found an old length of rope in the barn, stiff with age but still strong, and coiled it over his shoulder. A small pouch of nails and a hammer went into his belt in case he needed to brace a wall or wedge a door. At the last moment, he took a long knife from the chest at the foot of the bed, the one his father had given him years ago. He told himself it was only for comfort, a bit of steel in his hand to keep fear at bay, but he could not shake the thought that the shadows might hold more than just memories. Ayanna watched him from the doorway, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. She said nothing, but her eyes followed every motion, dark and steady. James could feel her worry like a hand on his back. He gave her a small nod as he passed, a silent promise that he would return, though he knew such promises were fragile. The well gaped at him like a black mouth as he approached. The rope creaked against the stone lip when he tied it off, and then he swung himself over the edge and began the descent. The air cooled as he went lower, the light from above shrinking until it was little more than a pale coin far overhead. When his boots touched the dry floor, he paused to light the lantern, shielding the flame until it caught and flared. The walls leapt into view, wet in places where moisture seeped through the cracks. The opening he had uncovered was just as he had left it, a dark oval leading into the earth. He ducked inside, holding the lantern before him, and moved forward slowly. The air smelled of old soil, iron, and something he could not name, a scent that made the hairs on his arms rise. Each step stirred the dust into faint spirals, and his own breathing seemed too loud in the stillness. He passed the small chamber where he had first seen the bones, forcing himself not to linger. There was nothing more to learn from that place. Beyond it, the tunnel curved slightly and then sloped downward, the ceiling supported by old timbers that groaned faintly as he brushed against them. The ground grew damper, and once or twice his boots sank into the mud, leaving a deep print. At last he saw the outline of a door ahead. It was heavy, made of iron, its surface flaking with rust but still solid. The sight of it made his stomach tighten. It did not look like something meant to keep weather out. It looked like something meant to keep things in. He set the lantern down, braced his shoulder against the door, and shoved. At first it resisted, the hinges shrieking, but then it gave with a shudder and swung inward. The chamber beyond was larger than he had expected, its ceiling arched with rough stone, and its walls lined with old wooden beams darkened by time. The air inside was colder still, so cold his breath fogged as he stepped through. The lantern light caught on objects scattered across the floor. Broken boards, twisted bits of metal, the remnants of what might have been bunks. The room smelled faintly of ash, as if something had once burned here, and the scent had never faded. James walked slowly, the beam of the lantern shifting over the walls. Near the far side of the chamber, he saw deep scratches gouged into the stone. He crouched, running his fingers over them, feeling the grooves that had been carved by desperate hands. It looked as though someone had clawed at the wall trying to escape. The thought made his throat dry. He rose and turned toward a shape in the corner. A large wooden crate collapsed under its own weight. Inside, half buried in dust, were more bones. Not just one set, but several, tangled together as though those who had died here had fallen close to one another. Some still had bits of cloth clinging to them, faded scraps that might once have been uniforms or blankets. Near the crate lay a small metal box, its lid half rusted through. James hesitated, then knelt and pried it open. Inside were brittle sheets of paper, yellowed with age but still legible in places. He lifted one carefully and held it toward the light. The writing was in Spanish, neat and precise, the letters marching across the page like soldiers. He could read enough to understand. Lists of names, numbers, notes about days without water, days without food. Words like resistencia and observation repeated over and over. These had been records, clinical in their detail, as if the suffering of the people locked down here had been nothing more than data. James felt a sickness rise in him and shoved the papers back into the box. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the history of this place. It must have been built during the wars with the tribes, perhaps as a holding place for prisoners. But the notes suggested something more than imprisonment. These were experiments, designed to see how long a man could last before breaking. He sank onto a broken bench, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He thought of Ayana, of her people, and wondered if some of their ancestors had been brought here, locked away in the dark until there was nothing left of them but bones and scratches on stone. The thought made his chest tighten until he could hardly breathe. The silence of the chamber grew heavier the longer he sat. At last he rose, his decision made. He could not leave the dead like this. They had been abandoned once, but he would not abandon them again. He would bring their remains to the surface, give them the dignity of a proper burial, and in doing so perhaps quiet the unease that had haunted him since he first uncovered the tunnel. As he turned to leave, the lantern caught on something half hidden under a collapsed beam. A leather-bound book, its cover charred, but still intact. James stooped and pulled it free. The pages inside were brittle but surprisingly well preserved, filled with writing in the same precise hand as the loose papers. He flipped through them quickly, his Spanish halting but good enough to catch the words that mattered. References to subjects, to trials, to failure rates. One entry spoke of water rations cut to zero and the reaction of the captives over the following days. Another noted that the final outcome was satisfactory and that the chamber was sealed. The book felt heavy in his hands, heavier than paper had a right to be. It was a record of cruelty, and he had found it. He closed it carefully and tucked it under his arm. If nothing else, it was proof that what had happened here was real, that the bones were not just relics of a forgotten skirmish, but victims of something darker. The lantern flickered then, the flame bending as though a breeze had passed through, though no breeze should have been able to reach this far underground. James stiffened, every muscle tense. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, followed by a noise that might have been the settling of stone or might have been something else entirely. He waited, holding his breath, but when no further sound came, he forced himself to move, walking quickly back toward the tunnel. The climb up the rope left his arms shaking, but when he pulled himself over the lip of the well and stood once more under the open sky, the air felt sweeter than it ever had. He carried the book to the porch and sat there until the sun began to dip, staring out at the land. The prairie was quiet, bathed in the gold of late afternoon, but he could no longer see it as he once had. This was not just a refuge, it was also a grave. That night he slept little, lying awake with the book beside him, its presence as heavy as a stone. He thought of the scratches in the wall, the names in the lists, the bones tangled together. He knew he could not keep this secret forever. The dead deserved more than silence. But first he would gather their remains, carry them up one by one, and lay them to rest under the open sky. Only then would he decide whether to share what he had found with the world. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, James rose again. He strapped the lantern to his belt, gathered canvas sacks for carrying the bones, and set his jaw. Today he would return to the chamber. Today he would begin the work of freeing the past from the dark. He felt no peace as he crossed the yard, but he felt purpose, and that was enough to keep his feet moving toward the waiting well. The dawn broke gray and heavy, as though the sky itself had sensed what James was about to do. He stood in the yard with the canvas sack slung over his shoulder, the lantern already lit, though the light had barely begun to spread across the prairie. The ground was damp from the faintest hint of a night mist, the air cool and still, and the well waited for him like a dark eye in the earth. His resolve was steady, but his chest was tight. The decision he had made the night before was final. There could be no more hesitation, no more leaving the dead where they had been abandoned. Today he would carry them out, give them a proper place beneath the sky, and perhaps in doing so quiet the weight that had pressed on him since he first opened the slab. He tied the rope securely and lowered himself into the darkness once again. The familiar chill closed around him, the smell of wet stone and rust settling into his lungs. His boots struck the earth at the bottom with a dull thud, and then he moved into the tunnel with the lantern swinging gently before him, its glow casting fleeting shapes along the walls. The way was easier now that he knew every turn, but it felt heavier somehow, as if the tunnels themselves had grown more watchful. When he entered the chamber, he stopped for a moment, letting the lantern light flood the room. It looked just as it had the day before. The broken bunks, the gouged walls, the scattered bones lying like mute accusations across the dirt. He crouched and began his work, moving with slow and careful hands. Each bone he lifted, he laid into the sack with a kind of reverence, brushing away the dust where he could, whispering apologies though no one was there to hear them. Sweat broke across his brow despite the cold air, and more than once he paused, gripping his knees to steady himself. It was hard work, harder than hauling a steer out of a bog or patching a fence in the midday heat. This was the labor of the soul as much as the body, and every fragment of bone he handled seemed to add to the weight pressing down on him. He was nearly finished with the first sack when he heard it, a low groan from somewhere beyond the chamber, the sound of earth shifting deep in the belly of the tunnel. James froze, his breath caught, the lantern flame quivering. For a long moment there was nothing, only the echo of his own pulse hammering in his ears. Then another sound came, sharper this time, the crack of timber giving way. Instinct drove him to his feet. He snatched the sack of bones and swung it over his shoulder, grabbed the lantern and turned toward the passage. Behind him came a dull, shuddering rumble, then a cascade of dust as part of the ceiling near the back of the chamber gave way. Stones and splinters rained down, filling the room with a choking haze. James staggered forward, coughing, his eyes watering as he stumbled into the tunnel. The passageway groaned around him, the supports creaking as if deciding whether to hold or collapse entirely. He pressed forward as quickly as he dared, the lanterns swinging wildly and throwing jagged shadows on the walls. Twice his boots slipped in the mud, and he nearly went to his knees, but he caught himself and pushed on, his lungs burning with the dust he had breathed in. By the time he reached the well shaft, the rumbling behind him had quieted, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the rasp of his own breath. The climb back up was brutal. The sack over his shoulder seemed to drag him backward with every step, the rope cutting into his palms until they bled. At last he pulled himself over the rim and collapsed on the grass, sucking in great gulps of clean air. The sky above had darkened while he was below, the clouds rolling in thick and low, and a cool wind swept over the yard, rattling the leaves of the twisted trees near the house. James lay on his back for a long moment, staring at the sky, then pushed himself up and untied the sack. One by one he removed the bones, laying them carefully on a blanket he had spread nearby. Ayana had come out of the house and now stood a little distance away, her face solemn, their son clinging to her skirts. She did not speak, but she nodded once when James looked up at her, as if to say she understood what he meant to do. Together they carried the remains to a rise near the edge of the property, a place where the wind blew clean and the grass grew tall and untrampled. James dug the grave himself, the shovel biting into the earth with a steady rhythm, the smell of turned soil filling the air. When it was done, they laid the bones inside, arranging them with care, and Ayana knelt to scatter handfuls of sage and wildflowers over them. She murmured words in her own tongue, her voice soft but strong, the sound carrying across the prairie like a prayer. James stood with his hat in his hands, his head bowed, listening to the cadence of her voice. When she finished, he covered the grave, tamping the soil flat with the back of the shovel, and stood looking down at it until the first drops of rain struck the brim of his hat. The rain came gently at first, then harder, drumming against the roof of the house, pattering against the boards of the porch, running in rivulets through the yard. James stood in it until he was soaked through, until the dirt of the grave turned dark and smooth. It felt like a benediction, as if the sky itself had come to witness what they had done. When he finally turned toward the house, he saw that the well had begun to glisten with water at its bottom once more, the storm feeding it back to life. That night they built a small fire near the house and sat together in silence, listening to the rain as it softened and then ceased, leaving the world washed and new. The air smelled of wet earth and grass, and for the first time since they had arrived, James felt as though the land had accepted them. The weight that had pressed on his chest since the day he uncovered the slab had eased, though it was not gone. Some burdens never truly left, but he could carry this one now. In the days that followed, he repaired the well more thoroughly, braced its walls, and cleared the debris from its bottom. The water rose steadily with each passing day until the bucket came up full again. He worked on the fences in the barn with renewed strength, no longer feeling as though the earth beneath him might give way at any moment. Each evening he walked to the rise where the grave lay, standing there as the sun set, hat in hand, a silent promise to the dead that they would not be forgotten. James knew he could not keep what he had found hidden forever. One day he would ride into the nearest town, find someone who could read the Spanish better than he, and show them the book he had brought from the chamber. The story of what had happened here deserved to be told, not left to rot in the dark. But for now it was enough to have given the dead a place under the open sky, enough to know that his son would grow up on land where the past had been faced rather than ignored. Late one afternoon, as he stood near the well watching the wind ripple the grass, James felt something he had not felt in a long time. It was not joy, not exactly, but a deep and quiet certainty that this was where he belonged. The land was no longer just a refuge. It was his home, his burden, and his charge. Whatever had been done here in the dark, whatever cruelty had been hidden, would no longer lie in silence. The past could not be undone, but it could be faced, and in facing it, he had taken the first step toward building the future he had dreamed of when he first set eyes on this place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky to a deep red, James set his hat back on his head and walked toward the house where Ayana waited with their son. Behind him the prairie stretched silent and wide, the grave on the rise a small dark mark against the grass, and the well glinting with fresh water under the fading light. For the first time since he had fled the town of his birth, James Harper no longer felt like a man running. He felt like a man who had stopped, who had chosen his ground, and who was ready to defend it. The prairie night closed around him as he stepped onto the porch, and the last light of day caught the edge of the horizon like a promise that tomorrow would be theirs to claim. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos. There are more powerful stories waiting for you. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.